So a couple of months ago, a friend of mine had a birthday and then invited us to go out and celebrate with her. And so we said we would go, right? Because at this stage of our lives, most of our friends are all above 30. So when we know we're getting invited to something, we know it's not going to be particularly crazy because ain't nobody got time or energy for that anymore, right? All she wanted to do was go out and get some chicken wings down at the Wild Wings Cafe in downtown and just hang out, sit around a table with good friends and just eat fried meat, right? Which, I don't know if you know, is exactly my idea of a good time, right? Low-key, high-calorie, over by 9 p.m. This thing is the total package. And so, of course, we said we would go, right? So we got ready, we put on our going-out clothes, by which I mean the only clothes left in our closet that haven't been permanently stained by sticky little toddler fingers. And we went out to just enjoy a nice, quiet evening downtown. But when we got to the restaurant, we realized there were just a couple of small problems with our plan. Number one, we decided we were going to go out on a Friday night in downtown. And I don't know if you've noticed, but downtown has changed a bit in the last few years. And often I remember that lots of good things are happening downtown, but I forget that if you try to go anywhere after 6 p.m., the place is just packed, right? Especially the restaurants. And that's doubly true for a restaurant like Wild Wings that's sort of ultra casual and people are just going to unwind after a long week. So we get there and the place is a zoo already. We're going to have to wait for a long time for our table and all of us are already hungry, right? So sort of strike one against the evening. And problem number two that makes that situation a little bit worse is that it was a Friday night in downtown during the month of March, right? Which meant nothing to me when we were planning this party, right? What could possibly draw larger than usual number of people to a sports bar type environment where there are giant TVs on the wall that show every sporting event all day long, right? Yeah, well, for my people out there who don't know, like I didn't know, it's March Madness, right? Which is in the name, but somehow we couldn't put two and two together to realize this place is going to be even crazier that night. Right? So not only is it full of people, but they are all behaving, frankly, very erratically, right? You know, people are cheering one minute and groaning the next and then doing sort of a whooping hands in the air thing the minute after that. I felt like Jane Goodall in the jungle watching the gorillas, right? And by that, I don't mean that you're a gorilla if you watch college basketball. I mean, I understand your society about that much, right? This is not how I spend my free time. And so I'm trying to figure out what's going on here, and it took us a good while to piece that together. So that makes the situation even crazier. And then problem number 3, stacked on top of it, makes things even worse. It's a Friday night, downtown, during March Madness, on St. Patrick's Day, right? And these people do not celebrate Christian missionaries the way that I tend to celebrate them. Right? So take the craziness of the first two things and then add about 100 more people stuffed into this building, some very green beer, right, and lots of leprechaun costumes, and a bunch of people who are talking much louder than they think they're talking because of the very green beer, right? The whole place was just pandemonium. Everybody was yelling. Here we are, quiet, meek friend group, standing outside, trying our hardest to struggle to have a conversation over all this noise. And at multiple points in the evening, we're accosted by these groups of overly friendly young people that we think have probably indulged again in the very green beer. The whole thing was just chaos. It's like the 30 minutes in our house before the kids go to bed, when all the order starts to melt down and everybody's fighting to stay up just a few minutes longer. It's like that, but with adults just cranked up to 11, right? And you have to remember, my idea of a good time, and most of my friends' idea of a good time, is a thick blanket in a quiet room with a Harry Potter novel, right? This is not how we tend to go out, right? I still enjoy a good pair of socks. My favorite color is actually gray. I think it's highly underrated, goes with everything, right? So words can't really express just how out of place I am in this kind of environment, Right? We still manage to have a good time because we're good friends and we're out there and we know eventually we are going to get food in our belly. But most of the time that we were there, we just felt kind of out of place. Like you stick out, like everybody around us can tell that we very clearly don't belong. Which is the kind of feeling that everybody's had at some point in their life, right? I mean, sometimes it happens in small, kind of silly ways that you can use at the beginning of a sermon, right, where you're trying to go out and get chicken wings. But other times, it's bigger than that, and it's actually kind of serious. Like that feeling that you get when you move to some new place where you don't know anyone, you don't know how to get around, and suddenly something as small as just trying to run a simple errand feels like a big, kind of daunting task because you don't belong here, right? The same feeling is the same kind of feeling you get when you're trying to break into a new group of friends, maybe at work or attending a new church, and everybody around you seems to know everybody else, and they all seem to have this shared body of stories that start with, remember that time when, and you don't understand what they're talking about. Right? That feeling of being on the outside. I mention that feeling to you because that kind of feeling, that anxiety that comes with being utterly out of place, I think, if we take that and we turn it up to 11, I think we might begin to get a sense of what Ruth feels like in our sermon text this morning. It's the sort of feeling that we're going to see a lot for the next several weeks because we're starting a new series today that we're calling Risk, where we're taking a look at stories of people in the Bible who took some large risk that God then used to move the mission of God to bring healing and wholeness to the world just a little bit further down the path. And that's what's happening in this story. And there are plenty of stories in the Bible, for sure, that do this kind of thing. But I think none of them are quite like the one that we have in Ruth, because the story of Ruth, it isn't really like other stories, not even like other stories in the Bible. There is no nefarious villain in Ruth. There is no massive battle or really any kind of grand scale action at all. And the people of God in the story of Ruth, they aren't in any sort of obvious trouble. The kind of trouble that often happens in the Old Testament where God has to swoop in and rescue them in order to preserve the mission. None of that is happening in Ruth. What we have here is something just a little bit different. This is a small story. It's a story about women and family and the kind of tragedy that's so personal that you wonder why this is included in the Bible at all. And you couldn't be faulted for that. This is a story that's just a bit different. And it's a story that goes like this. During the time of the Judges, there was an Israelite family living in Bethlehem made up of Elimelech and his wife Naomi and their two sons whose names I'm not going to try to pronounce because Karen already did it. Right? And things were going pretty well for this family, we presume, until a famine strikes the land. And suddenly they have to pick up and move everything they own down to the land of Moab. Which might seem a little bit extreme to us, but you have to remember, this is the time before Walmart, right? So if the crops didn't come in on time, or if rain or sun or disease just ruined them altogether, you can't just run out to the store and pick up a couple of packs of ramen or something else purely synthetic to get you through, right? If there's no harvest, there's no food. And if there's no food in the place where you live for long enough, you and your family are going to die. And so they really had no other choice. And really, that's the only way you can explain why this family would choose to move to Moab, because we have to remember, too, that the Israelites and the Moabites are very old enemies. Like back to the book of Numbers old, centuries old at this point. And so as an Israelite family, you wouldn't choose to move to a place like Moab unless you were truly desperate. But that said, after they made the move, things seemed to go pretty well for a while. They were able to stay there 10 years. They ate food, which they wouldn't have been able to do if they stayed in Bethlehem. And they managed to marry off both of their sons to two Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. Right? That's Orpah, not Oprah. Okay. Things went pretty well for them in Moab, but they didn't go Oprah well. Right? So just then, as things are starting to look up for this little family, That's when tragedy strikes, as it so often does in the Bible. Naomi's husband, Elimelech, passes away. And not long after that, both of their sons pass away as well. And so now this little family, for whom things started to go well again for just a little bit, now Naomi is left widowed and childless. And her daughters-in-law, who are apparently very good and upright women in spite of what Israelites tend to think of Moabites, they are left widowed and childless as well. Now, bearing the weight of that kind of grief is more than many of us can understand, right? Even in our own time. But in their time, there were things about living in their world that made that situation even worse. In the ancient world, one of the last things you wanted to be was a woman on your own. There are plenty of stories in the Bible of women who were powerful figures, women who were rulers and judges and military leaders, right? And I don't want to downplay that or dismiss those women. They deserve all kinds of recognition. But the truth is that they were the exception to the rule. In this world, a woman without a husband or sons was a woman without protection or rights or any substantial source of income. And the laws that we find in books like Leviticus and Deuteronomy do make provisions for people in Israel who are in those kind of situations, right? Like requiring a deceased husband's family member to marry the widowed woman so that she doesn't lose access to that kind of protection and security forever. Right? It's a practice that seems odd to us, but it's a way of making sure that women have protection in a very dangerous world. And so it's clear, I think, throughout the Old Testament that God is deeply concerned with people in this kind of position. And he wants to make sure that they have a safety net. But in practice, Israel didn't always follow those commands. Sometimes widows and immigrants were just left out on their own because people didn't do what the law required them to do, even though they weren't supposed to be left that way. And I think that's what makes this most famous part of the story, the part that's in our text this morning, so utterly compelling for us, even all these years later. Because when Ruth is faced with the option to stay among her own people, where maybe, if she's lucky, she might be able to find another husband and have sons for herself and regain that kind of security that she's lost after her husband passed away. Instead, she chooses to go with Naomi back to Israel. She tells her, "Do not press me to leave you or turn me back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. And where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and even more as well, if even death parts me from you." This is an incredibly powerful pledge of allegiance. Right? Not only because Ruth isn't required to make these kind of promises at all. Right? She's bound to Naomi through marriage, but it's not like she's blood. It's not like she has to stay. Not only is it a powerful pledge for that reason, but also because this is a deeply risky move on her part. If Ruth goes back to Israel with Naomi, she is hitching her wagon to somebody with very few social options left. No protection, no income, and very little hope of getting those things back when she gets back to Israel. And even if things do go well for Naomi, there's no guarantee that if Ruth goes with her, that things are going to go well for Ruth as well. And yet, in spite of all the uncertainty in their situation, and in spite of her outsider status, she still chooses to follow Naomi. She takes the risk. And we presume that she does it simply because she loves her mother-in-law. And it's the next right thing for her to do. Right? Which might sound like a trite observation, especially given how much Ruth sacrifices in order to move back to Israel with her mother-in-law. But I think that if we don't see that small element of the story, I think we miss one of the things that makes it one of the most distinctive stories in the Bible. Throughout the book of Ruth, even beyond this one big risk, almost everyone that we encounter in this story just chooses to do the next right thing, which, even though it doesn't sound like it, actually is distinctive because it almost never happens in Scripture. Almost every story in the Old Testament, especially the Old Testament, hinges on some large act of obedience or disobedience on sort of an epic scale, right? Some big intervention from God, something like that. But at the core of this story is just one person choosing to follow another person to a place where they don't really belong. No one gets swallowed. No one slays a giant or destroys an army. Nothing big like that happens. And yet the story still moves forward anyway. Ruth stays faithful to Naomi, even though it means that living as an immigrant in a land where she might experience some hostility from the people around her. Naomi stays faithful to Ruth, even though she's another mouth to feed if she takes her on the road with her. And she's somebody who's unwanted as a rule in the land of Israel. Neither of those things is epic in scope or scale. They're just the next right thing to do. And the story moves forward anyway. And that remains true as the story continues beyond our text this morning. When those two women arrive in Israel, they find a relative of Naomi's named Boaz, who sees this hungry foreigner, Ruth, scrounging for food in his field. And he allows her to glean the wheat that the reapers at the harvest don't catch, so that she has something to eat. And he gives her protection from the male workers in the field so that she's not taken advantage of. And at its heart, all he's doing there is just what God has commanded the people of Israel to do, to look out for the widows and the foreigners in their land. And because he chooses to do that, these two women don't starve to death, and they aren't taken advantage of by the men who work in the field. They're kept safe from them. And a little bit later in the story, when Naomi tells Boaz that he is their kinsman redeemer, by which she means that he is the one, according to the law, who can provide them with the kind of protection they need by marrying Ruth if he so chooses, he just chooses to do it. Boaz marries Ruth, even though that's a risk for him, because marrying a Moabite woman in Israel is not exactly smiled upon. And it's a risk that he could have dodged if he wanted to, but he doesn't, presumably because it's just the next right thing to do. And because all of these things happen, because everybody makes these small decisions all along the way to do the next right thing, the story that begins with tragedy and death ends with Ruth being married and having a baby. And so a story that begins with death ends with new life, and in a way ends up redeeming the tragedies of that story's beginning. And what's truly remarkable about all of that is that not one decision along the way was epic in scope or scale. Everyone in the story is just doing the next right thing, even when it means taking a risk. And because they managed to do that next right thing, through their obedience, the mission of God moves forward. And I think that's an important thing for us to hear. Because here's the truth. The Christian life is made up almost entirely of those next right thing decisions. That's it. There are so many accounts in the Bible of God acting in some big and decisive way to bring about change and restoration. There are so many stories of biblical heroes who have God's help and through God are able to do these big world-shaping sort of things. And I got to tell you, I love those stories. I appreciate having them in the body of Scripture. It's good to see how God has worked in the world in wondrous ways. But I can't relate to those people. And my guess is that most of you can't either. Most of us don't end up experiencing some big world-shaping event at some point in our Christian life. We can relate to this story. Because in this one, God isn't making some grand, dramatic entrance. In fact, God doesn't directly act in this story at all. That's what makes it one of the most interesting stories in the Old Testament. A few of the characters here mention God, and they attribute different things to God, but God is never spoken of by the narrator as doing the thing that changes the story. And yet, it's meant to be clear to us, I think, that God is behind the scenes moving this story along. I mean, how else can we explain the transformation from famine and death at the beginning to birth and new life and security at the end of this story? We are meant to notice that kind of parallel in this text and to see God at work in the decisions to take small risks along the way and to do those next right things that might lead to something small but good. And even if we do miss that in this story, even if the readers of Scripture miss that in the original hearing, and I don't think they did, we're definitely not supposed to miss it at the end of the story. Because after Ruth gets married and after she has this baby and her story is redeemed a bit, we have something a little bit odd at the end of this book. It's a genealogy. Right? It's the kind of thing that if you're following a Bible reading plan, you typically just blow right past because nobody likes to read so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. Right? But this one is a little bit different. For one thing, it's not 3 chapters long like it sometimes is. And for another, you'll actually notice some of the names in this list, especially the ones at the end. Boaz was the father of Obed. Obed was the father of Jesse. And Jesse was the father of David. As in the David, King David, the most renowned king in the whole history of Israel. Ruth, according to this story, is David's great-grandmother. Right? So through a series of next right thing decisions, a series of just small risks at the right time, a Moabite woman outsider not only finds a place among God's people, but finds a place in a kingly line, a line that leads to David and even beyond David, as we heard from our text in Matthew this morning, all the way to Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And I think that's important for us to hear. This matters because our attempts to be faithful in the busyness and uncertainty and risk of life often seem impossibly small. Too small to make any difference. And on our very worst days, they seem just downright insignificant. I think all of us have felt that at some point in our lives. We feel powerless to do anything about the evil that plagues the world, to make even one small dent in the problems that we see that need healing. But the story of Ruth reminds us that even when we don't see God act in some grand dramatic way, even when we can't see our way to our own restoration, let alone how our story fits into the larger story that God is trying to tell about how the world is being made whole again, even then, God is there. God is there. God is working in our small acts of loyalty to Christ and the kingdom and the people around us, sometimes in bigger ways than we could have possibly imagined in the moment. All that remains for us is to do the next right thing. That's it. The next thing that honors the worth of another person. The next thing that brings hope where there is none. The next thing that meets some need, even a small one, that could bring some bit of joy and life to the world. Do the next right thing. And I don't just mean that generally. I mean you as an individual. Do the next right thing. Find somebody who needs a friend and try inviting them to dinner. And see, when somebody invites you to dinner, see that as a need for some kind of friendship and community and take them up on it. And in those small acts of risk and loyalty, I think you'll begin to find that you start to build the kind of community that people in our culture are hungering for, the kind of place where they can find God at work. Try speaking a kind word to a person who obviously needs one. Offer your neighbor a hand, the nice one next door and the weird one across the street, right? Both of them. And when that person offers you a hand in return, take it and begin to build those relationships of reciprocity where people can begin to see God at work in your life and the kingdom can make an entrance. Find one small problem in your community, on your street, one small thing that you can fix to bring a bit of joy to the world, because here's the truth. Small acts of obedience and loyalty done long enough and loving enough with the blessing of a good and loving God, those are the things that most often move the mission of God forward. do the next right thing, even if it means taking a risk. Now, I've said we're called to do that as individuals, and that's true, but we're also called to do that as communities, and communities of faith. So we've been teasing for the last few weeks that we're going to be revealing our next steps for Grandview. And so if you haven't heard about that, that's coming this Wednesday night at 6 o'clock in this room. Right? If you haven't made plans to be there, you should come. We have childcare available for birth through third grade. We'll have snacks. The whole thing can be a low-key, high-calorie, done by 9 p.m. event if you want it to be, right? And if you come, I think what you're going to see is that we're going to be doing something big next, and we're going to be doing something risky. But at its heart, all we're trying to do is just the next right thing. And this is something that you can be a part of. In fact, it's something we need you to be a part of. And as we do that together, as we try to move the mission of God forward just a little bit through our small acts of obedience, we can do so knowing that sometimes God uses those acts of obedience to move the kingdom forward in much larger ways than we could have ever imagined. All that remains for us is to do the next right thing. Will you pray with me, please?